Good morning, guys. Happy Friday. So we're 1 week away. Remember to kind of start going through those checklists that I sent out earlier this week. Take the time to go through those if you haven't done so already, just to make sure that all your ducks are in a row and you're ready a week from today, which 1 o'clock will be the test time. So let's talk about period 6 today. But what I first want to do is kind of recap just where kind of period 6 comes in. Now, remember, period 6 is the time after the Civil War. So you have the year 1866. And it's going to run through the 1890s. And what it sets up is what our economy becomes ultimately in the end. Our economy is going to go from an agrarian society to one that is going to be the producer of things in the world. I often stated in class that we were the China of today back then. We produce everything. It didn't say made in China, it said made in America. And there's a reason for that. We had an abundance of cheap labor, much like China does today. And that labor coupled with the growing industrial might of America. Remember, we started to expand. And with expansion, we started to come up with new ways to transport goods. This came through canals and trains. Now, this was all a part of Henry Clay's American system, but in a wider sense, it was what historians and history remembers it now as a market revolution. And guys, the market revolution takes place in the early 1800s to the mid 1800s, and it really gives rise to the period of what we're going to talk about today, period 6, and the Industrial Revolution and how that's going to take hold, and where the transition by the end of the 1800s happens, where you see more people living in cities than you do see living in rural areas. So we start with the idea of the market revolution where it was. We were an agrarian society. It was the idea of Jefferson that you produce these things of substance and you sell those things. But it was a lot of it, too, was subsistence living, meaning that you produce what you needed and then maybe you have a little bit more to sell at market. But it wasn't where you produce products to truly sell to other people. And that's the shift and the change. And with that, you need industrialization. And industrialization is going to happen mainly in the North for obvious reasons. The South has slavery. The South has cash crops that really, and then a lot of men in the South are obviously yeoman farmers. They're not, these major plantations. Remember, those are like corporations, major corporations of today, like your Walmart or your Target. They're few and far between. There's not a lot of them. They were massive in a sense of how much land and space they took up, but the majority of Southerners were yeoman farmers, mainly subsistence living. Again, they're growing enough to support their families, and then they have a little bit left over that they can sell to try to, add in to their funds. But this is going to shift. And with the Industrial Revolution, people start moving into the city areas and staying in the city areas, mainly immigrants coming in this country. And there's 2 new immigrants in the mid 1800s that are going to be coming in, and it's Germans and Irish. And they're going to be settling in the Midwest areas. Remember when we did that class activity, I had you held up your hand if you were German or Irish. It always in these classes, it's 90% of the students raise their hand. This is that time period where Germans and Irish are really going to get their foothold. They're not accepted widely. They are rejected by American society because they're the newest immigrants coming to this country, and it's just kind of a really bad process of how things typically happen in America, but one that is repeated with the Germans and the Irish. So the Irish are, most of them that are coming over are poor, and they don't have more than the shirt on their back. So many of them actually stay in the cities. And we talked about New York City and 5 Points. This is where you're going to get a job. You're going to go to work. And Germans, however, a lot of them do come with some savings, and they're able to settle in the Midwest area to buy land. That's relatively cheap. And a lot of them become farmers. And so you see them pushing more towards the Midwest. They can also afford the price to travel, which is also important if you want to get out there. But you could start to see how this country is shaping up with people who are settling in cities. And what they're going to do. They're going to go to work in garment factories. They're going to go to work once the Industrial Revolution kicks in and we start seeing steel being produced. And the list again is going to go on and on. This is going to rapidly change our cities' steel production. Instead of building outward, we're going to be building upward. So the market revolution is the prelude to what we see in a sense with period 6 and the really boom time of American industry. So this time period also represents disparities in wealth. Why disparities in wealth? Remember, it is thought, as Twain said, that we were it was coined the Gilded Age because it was gold plated, but when you really look inside America and what it was to be, you saw a lot of poverty, a lot of struggle just to survive, just to put food on the table. And so there was this fight that is going to happen between the wealthy industrialists and their many workers who are producing, what's the things that are making these people rich. These men are known as robber barons. And you had robber barons in every major industry, Vanderbilt in railroad. You also had Carnegie in steel. You had Rockefeller in oil. And you're going to have J.P. Morgan in just about everything. But what we see are major banks in the growth of American wealth, in that institution growing. All of this became the Hamiltonian viewpoint. This is exactly what he thought of in a sense of America's potential. The growth of an empire is happening. America is becoming an economic giant in the world. And with that, it's also going to become a political giant, one that we see today, superpower, so to speak. These are the types of things that you have to kind of connect together if you want to see America as it transitions from this agrarian society, these sleepy rural areas, into, the metropolises and the cities that we see today. So the fight really ensues because of the poor working conditions for many of these men and women. These are dangerous conditions. Yes, women are now joining the workforce. They're the ones who are mainly working in those garment factories, which are also very, very dangerous, as we find out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And this shocks America that in the American citizenry that they would allow a business would allow their workers to work in such hazardous conditions where many of them are forced to jump from a window because it's either die of smoke inhalation or die from the fall. And it's shocking. It's one that the Americans, start pushing for change. But before any of that, too, there's Americans that are rallying in the late 1800s in a way to grow strength in numbers. And guys, think about that. Unions is what changes really the working conditions of society and the things that they're going to work for. The bread and butter ask that they want are going to be higher wages, safer working conditions, and less hours. Remember, the hours that they're working are extreme. The working conditions that they're working on are dangerous, and their pay is absolutely horrendous. So unions begin to form. And the first union that forms is the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor is going to be for skilled and unskilled labor. Remember, unskilled labor would be like factory work. Skilled labor, though, comes where you would have to go in some type of apprenticeship to learn a skill in order to make money. Things like, a blacksmith, carpenter, those are apprenticeship programs where you have skilled labor. Unskilled labor is tough because those people are expendable to their employers. And what I mean by that is you could get fired and they could train a guy off the street in a day and he takes your job. And that's hard to get you higher pay. So the Knights of Labor really struggled with that. And there was, infighting between the skilled and unskilled labor, because the skilled labor guys are like, these guys are cheapening our union and they're really hurting us in the end. And so, the first union that springs up is the Knights of Labor. The second union that's going to spring up is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. That's going to include skilled laborers. And this is where you're going to see the growth, in a sense, of that union. And the reason why, because it was seclusive, in a sense, just for skilled laborers. The other thing, too, is the Knights of Labor is crushed by the 1886 Haymarket Affair. Remember, the people at that Haymarket Affair were made out to be anarchist, and they were rebel rousers. They were causing this trouble. And the majority of them were thought to be from the Knights of Labor Union and the kind of people that would be a part of it. And it was completely untrue. But again, remember who controlled the papers at the time. And this is the problem in what we see in society. Politics were being bought out by the wealthiest individuals. I mean, you had a few men in industries that were buying presidential elections. And you can see this. Obviously, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, these guys give a ton of money to get their guys elected, including one of our presidents, William McKinley. And so a lot of Americans themselves thought that this system was wrong and knew that they had to fight against it somehow. And how did they do that? They gained strength through gaining the majority of people, strength in numbers. The more people you have, the more voice you have to create that change. The other thing that we see is it doesn't spring up in the cities' unions. Yes, the Knights of Labor and what I talked about with the AFL, sure, those were. But there were the rural areas, and you had things like the Grange movement that is really going to change how Americans think. And this happens as Americans begin to settle out west, which is also in this period. Westward expansionism, the extension of manifest destiny, 1850s and beyond is where we're going to see again the wide expansion of America all the way from east to west. And the reason why is because of transportation in trains and the Transcontinental Railway, which again, we see the fruition of by the end of the 1860s. And so now all of a sudden America is expanding. And with it, there is the idea that they have to grow their product or ship their hog or ship their cattle all the way to the East Coast, where it's going to be slaughtered and then sold in market. And that's how they make their money. Now, there's a problem with this. They don't own the railways, and the railway owners are going to take advantage of this. They know that they have these farmers out in the plain states, and they're going to make them pay. And there's going to be things, too, that are completely out of their control. And this is what I mean by that is also the railway owners. They had nothing to do with the tragic events that many of these farmers are going to face in the 1880s and in the 1870s, where you're going to see natural disasters, anything from droughts and fires because of it, to the idea of floods, destroying crops. And then not to mention massive tornadoes that come sweeping through these areas. This is Tornado Alley, right? So, and locusts descending on their fields and destroying their crops for 3 years. This is what these guys face, and they feel like this is, the end of the world. It's Armageddon. I mean, they have to feel that way. These farmers out there, everything's going against them, and many of them end up going bust and returning back to the city. But some will make it. But what they start to do out there to increase their strength, they're the ones who teach America how to really strengthen their voices by banding together. And what we see is the Farmers Alliance. And the Farmers Alliance is what gives them this strength. Why? Because politicians have to answer to them. If they align together, they can force the hand of politicians to create change. And why? Because they need their vote. They don't get elected unless these people vote for them. And so the farmers know that they have them. This Farmers Alliance is an ingenious idea, and it works perfectly. They actually start to see change. The American government even starts to institute policies in interstate trade to control these issues that were completely, out of whack and out of hand for them. This is what's going to strengthen America ultimately in the end. The culminating piece of legislation that is really going to show how Americans or the Farmers Alliance really worked as they band together is the Sherman Antitrust Act that is going to regulate interstate trade and is going to stop the price gouging that was going on in the railway systems. And this allows farmers to start saving up money and increasing their own wealth as time moves on. But this fight is going to spill over not only from the Farmers Alliance and the growth of unions in cities, and then the fight between the struggle of the wealthiest individuals. And then you're going to also have theories that are going to spring up. You have Darwinism, the idea of survival of the fittest. Well, this fits into actually from society and human side of things, social Darwinism, that men of power and wealth were born to become wealthy and powerful, that they were superior in their intellect, that they had superior traits next to their fellow man. Now, this obviously is working to their advantage, but the wealthiest individuals definitely had more than just the idea of social Darwinism. They had the pockets lined of politicians. And corruption, in a sense, was rampant, and society was pushing and looking for change. This will bring on some major change within this next period 7, the beginning of it, which is going to be known as progressivism. Progressives are going to try to change things for the better. They're going to try to increase the power of each individual in society. I mean, this is a republic, a democratic republic, one that includes the American citizenry to have the power, to have the say. Well, they're losing that. They're losing that because they can't compete with the big money in politics. All this, again, recognized, as we talked about in Wizard of Oz, the movie and the book. This idea of this society that's kind of off kilter, and one that the people are going to have to try to take back if they band together, if they work together. And that's really, again, what the Americans started to see through the rise of unions at this time. But you also see these robber barons and the idea of ostentatious living. Some of them live these extravagant lifestyles, massive mansions, gold-plated this and gold-plated that. These places were, unbelievable. And the common man is struggling to just put food on the table. But for some of these men, they also felt that they had a duty, in a sense, because they were so wealthy, that they had to give back. And Carnegie was one of the leaders in this, the gospel of wealth, that you have to improve these institutions. Rockefeller, the same way. These men started to invest in things like libraries and educational institutions and colleges and universities. This was a vehicle for the people to lift themselves up out of poverty, they felt. And they felt that they were duty bound to carry through with this. But in the end, we see monopolies that are going to form. And these monopolies can become extremely dangerous when they start breaking down the competition in a certain market. For example, if Rockefeller controls oil, well, he can price gouge the heck out of everyone because oil becomes a necessity product in America. Same thing with steel in Carnegie. I mean, these things are necessity. There's no way that people can move forward, in a sense, or American society can move forward without them. And so this is where it becomes dangerous, and why they start to try to break up these industries. And this comes with also the Sherman Antitrust Act, not only in a sense regulation of trade through railways and things like that. And building on this, it's even further. It says that monopolies that form, that hurt, again, the American people or American society, need to be broken up. It's an antitrust, anti-monopoly bill. And it comes because of the rise of the people banding together through unionism, not only in the city areas, but as I mentioned to you, even in the plains, who started this whole thing. So when you start to see, again, the progressives, they need a champion, in a sense, that's going to take down these monopolies, because the presidents themselves aren't going to do anything. I just told you, McKinley was bought out. He was elected because of the money that was put in. But what they don't see coming is that McKinley is going to be assassinated. And they had a man that they had put in the vice president role to try to ruin him politically, to try to put him, as they felt, in the most useless role in American politics, the vice presidency, to minimize him and his rise. But Teddy Roosevelt will become president because of the fact of McKinley's assassination. And with that, he will begin the busting up of trust and the taking down of monopolies. And this starts this process that we're going to get to, in a sense, of period 7. But this is widely this period known as 6. It's this fight between uh, wealthy individuals, and the common man, and who's really going to control society in multiple different forms. Even in the idea of how you vote. Remember, before this, you would vote in a line, and your supervisor or your boss would be standing there watching which way you voted, who you voted for. There were two separate ballot boxes. They knew exactly who you're going to vote for, whether it be at the time now Democrat or Republican. But then you have a secret ballot system that is going to be brought on, and this is going to change. That brings, I guess, the safety to them that they can vote and choose how they wish, which fits in with our Bill of Rights, the freedom of choice and the freedom of speech. Those are examples how America is growing its democracy. But as I close here too, there's one thing I want to touch on, and it comes really what we talked about yesterday in period 5. There is a shift of African Americans that starts at this period in the 1890s. This starts the Great Migration, and African Americans are going to start moving from rural areas in the South to the city areas of the North. And this is really going to be a springboard during the times of both world wars, where production is going to be needed as white men are out, or overseas fighting in two world wars. There is going to be a vacuum that is going to be filled by women and African Americans to create, to fulfill these production jobs. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Period 7, this is another big one. Period 7 has a lot in it. It's our last one. And remember, the test itself consists of periods 3 through 7. But the AP board has really said that you can use period 1 and 2 also. It says nothing, however, about period 7 and 8. It says you won't use those. So you can widely ignore those. But what you need to pay attention to, specifically 3 through 7, but they said that you can bring in outside information from 1 and 2, which kind of is a little bit of a tell. And we'll talk about that next week of what this could be and what your possible questions could be. You guys have a great weekend. We'll talk to you again on Monday.